They pay his rent. They buy his houses. They buy his planes. They buy his yacht.
February 5th, 2025 was meant to be a night of unity, a gathering where believers from different backgrounds came together, not to debate, but to worship. The atmosphere was reverent, the crowd expectant, the stage prepared for a message of faith and encouragement. No one walked into that room expecting history to be made in the way it was. Yet by the end of the night, the event would be discussed across churches, social media platforms, and religious circles worldwide, not because of a sermon, but because of a confrontation that forced a deeper conversation about modern faith, leadership, and the future of the church. What unfolded was not simply a clash between two pastors, but a visible collision between two philosophies that have been quietly pulling the church in opposite directions for years. Two voices, one stage. On one side stood Pastor Gino Jennings, a man known for uncompromising sermons, plain delivery, and a theology rooted in restraint, discipline, and separation from worldly excess. To his followers, he represents consistency and fearlessness, a voice unwilling to soften truth for comfort. On the other side was Pastor Keion Henderson, a leader often associated with modern presentation, expansive outreach, and a message centered on possibility, growth, and relevance in a changing world. To his supporters, he embodies accessibility, progress, and the ability to speak faith in a language today's generation understands. Both men carried influence, both carried conviction, and neither was accustomed to backing down. That night, for the first time, their visions stood face to face under the same lights. The moment the room shifted. What began as a calm sequence of events subtly shifted when Pastor Jennings took the microphone without ceremony. There was no applause cue, no easing into commentary, just a deliberate stillness as he stood. His posture was firm, his tone measured, his presence unmistakably serious. The room, which moments earlier hummed with quiet conversation, fell into attentive silence. He spoke not with anger, but with gravity, addressing the responsibility of spiritual leadership and the dangers of confusing faith with performance. Though he did not initially name anyone, the direction of his gaze made it clear that his words were not abstract. They were pointed, intentional, and meant to challenge. A challenge, not a performance pastor. Jennings spoke about the church as sacred ground, not a stage, and about the calling of ministry as service rather than spectacle. His message emphasized sacrifice, humility, and caution against allowing popularity to shape theology. He warned of the temptation to measure spiritual success through numbers, visibility, and applause rather than transformation and accountability. The audience listened closely, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily. It was not the language of accusation but of confrontation, challenging ideas rather than indicting a person, yet clearly drawing a line that demanded response. Silence. Before the response. For several long moments, Pastor Keion Henderson remained seated, listening. Those closest to the stage later described the silence as heavy, not hostile, but charged with expectation. This was not the type of moment that could be brushed aside with diplomacy. The room understood that what was unfolding mattered beyond personal disagreement. It reflected a larger tension many churches had quietly wrestled with: how to remain spiritually grounded while adapting to cultural change. When Henderson finally stood, the shift was immediate. Conversation stopped. Every eye followed him, speaking from conviction. When Pastor Henderson took the microphone, his voice was calm, not defensive. He acknowledged the seriousness of the moment and addressed the room rather than his counterpart alone. He spoke about calling, purpose, and the belief that reaching people requires meeting them where they are. He questioned whether visibility and success automatically diminish sincerity, and whether growth should be viewed as compromise or opportunity. His tone was controlled, deliberate, and rooted in conviction rather than emotion. The audience reaction was mixed, but engaged. This was no longer a one-sided moment. It had become a dialogue. Two definitions of faith. What became clear as the exchange continued was that this was not about personal dislike, but fundamentally different definitions of faith leadership. Pastor Jennings framed faith as something that should resist cultural influence, standing apart even when unpopular. Pastor Henderson framed faith as something that should move within culture, influencing it rather than withdrawing. One emphasized preservation, the other expansion. Neither man shouted, neither resorted to insults. Yet the tension between their perspectives was unmistakable and profound. The crowd reacts. As the discussion unfolded, the audience mirrored the divide. Some responded with quiet affirmation to Pastor Jennings' emphasis on simplicity and restraint. Others resonated with Pastor Henderson's message of relevance and reach. The atmosphere was no longer passive. People whispered, shifted in their seats, and leaned forward. This was no longer just an event. It had become a live illustration of an ongoing debate within modern Christianity, one many had experienced privately, but rarely seen addressed so openly. Accountability versus adaptation. Pastor Jennings returned to the microphone with a firm but steady tone, reiterating his belief that faith must never be shaped by popularity or economics. He warned of the risk of allowing systems, branding, or expansion strategies to overshadow spiritual responsibility. His words focused on accountability, caution, and the long-term consequences of blending sacred purpose with worldly metrics. Again, his approach was principled rather than personal, yet unmistakably challenging. A defense of reach. Pastor Henderson responded by emphasizing stewardship, arguing that influence and resources can be used responsibly to reach more people and provide broader support. He spoke of outreach programs, community impact, and the realities of operating in a world where communication platforms and infrastructure require investment. His message was not framed as opposition to holiness, but as an evolution in method rather than belief. The audience remained divided but attentive. When the room felt divided. At this point, the tension reached a level that could no longer be ignored. It was not hostility but a deep unease, an awareness that something foundational was being examined in real time. This was not entertainment. It was uncomfortable, raw, and revealing. Both men spoke from deeply held convictions, and neither appeared interested in winning the moment. Instead, they were defending visions they believed were necessary for the future of faith. A voice from the audience. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from the audience broke the structured exchange. A former attendee of Pastor Henderson's church stood and spoke, not with accusation, but with emotion. He described his personal experience, his admiration, and his concerns, expressing confusion rather than condemnation. His words reflected a tension many in the room felt but had not articulated. The moment added a layer of humanity that shifted the tone again, grounding the debate in lived experience rather than ideology alone. The weight of responsibility. Pastor Henderson listened with visible care, no longer rushing to respond or defend, his posture shifting from certainty to contemplation. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone aware that leadership is not only about vision, but about consequence. He acknowledged that influence magnifies both intention and impact, and that guiding thousands, sometimes millions, of people comes with a burden that cannot be taken lightly. He did not deny growth, success, or visibility, but he questioned the assumption that prosperity automatically signals moral failure. Instead, he invited reflection on whether success itself is corrupting, or whether corruption comes from losing one's purpose along the way. His tone suggested introspection rather than resistance, a recognition that leadership requires continual self-examination. The room felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a defense of systems or styles. It had become a deeper examination of responsibility, accountability, and the unseen weight carried by those who stand at the front. A pause that spoke loudly. Pastor Jennings did not answer right away. His silence stretched long enough to be felt, not as avoidance, but as deliberation. In a space where words had come quickly, the pause itself became meaningful, allowing the tension to settle and the moment to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice returned to the foundation of his message. That faith must remain anchored in integrity, clarity, and accountability, regardless of how methods evolve. He emphasized that leadership naturally invites scrutiny, not because people are hostile, but because influence demands transparency. To him, examination was not persecution, it was part of the calling. His tone softened just enough to reveal concern rather than confrontation, but his position remained firm. The principles he stood for had not shifted. The pause had not weakened his stance. It had strengthened its gravity. No clear winner. As the exchange came to an end, there was no decisive moment of triumph. No applause crowned a victor, no statement resolved the tension neatly. Instead, what lingered was something far more complex and powerful, a shared awareness that the church itself was standing at a crossroads. People did not leave buzzing with excitement, but with questions. The absence of a clear winner was not a failure of the moment. It was its purpose. The conversation did not conclude when the microphones were lowered. It followed people into their cars, into late-night discussions at kitchen tables, into quiet prayers and online debates. The lack of resolution forced reflection, and reflection proved far more enduring than spectacle ever could. The aftermath online. Within hours, fragments of the exchange appeared across social media platforms, clipped, captioned, and interpreted through countless lenses. As often happens, nuance struggled to survive the speed of online reaction. Some framed the moment as confrontation, others as courage, and many reduced it to sides that demanded allegiance. Yet those who had been present understood that what unfolded was not scandal, but exposure, not of wrongdoing, but of division, perspective, and unresolved tension within modern faith communities. The online discourse revealed how hungry people were for clarity, and how quickly complexity is flattened when moments are removed from their full context. Still, the widespread attention signaled that the conversation touched something real and unresolved. Reflection rather than resolution. In the days that followed, what stood out most was what did not happen. Neither pastor escalated the moment publicly. There were no inflammatory statements, no prolonged sparring through interviews or social media posts. Responses, when given, were measured and restrained. This restraint reinforced the sense that the encounter had never been about spectacle or personal attack. It had been about responsibility, both to congregations and to the broader faith community. By choosing not to extend the conflict, both leaders allowed space for reflection rather than reaction. The absence of continued confrontation kept the focus where it belonged, on the deeper questions raised, not on the personalities involved. What the moment represented. More than anything, February 5th functioned as a mirror. It reflected the ongoing tension between tradition and innovation, between restraint and expansion, between preservation and adaptation. It revealed how deeply divided perceptions of leadership and faith expression have become, even among those who share the same foundational beliefs. The moment forced believers to ask difficult questions that rarely receive public attention. What does faith look like in a modern world shaped by visibility and influence? How should leaders balance reach with humility? Where is the line between relevance and compromise? The power of the moment lay not in the answers it provided, but in the honesty of the questions it surfaced. Faith at a crossroads. The church has always evolved, shaped by culture, history, and circumstance. But moments like this make evolution visible rather than theoretical. They expose fault lines that can no longer be ignored. Whether one resonated more with Pastor Jennings' caution or Pastor Henderson's optimism, it became clear that neither approach can exist without accountability. Tradition without reflection risks stagnation. Innovation without restraint risks drift. Faith, by nature, is living and dynamic, but it is also rooted in principles that demand stewardship. The crossroads revealed that the future of the church will require both conviction and humility, structure and openness, depth and reach. The lasting impact. Long after the event itself faded from headlines, its impact continued quietly. Not because of controversy, but because of honesty. Two leaders stood publicly in their convictions without resorting to spectacle or dehumanization. They disagreed openly, firmly, and respectfully, something increasingly rare in public discourse. In doing so, they modeled a form of confrontation that did not seek destruction, but clarification. For many observers, that example mattered more than the content of the disagreement itself. It demonstrated that tension does not have to lead to division, and that disagreement, when handled with integrity, can strengthen rather than fracture community. A conversation that continues. The night did not offer final answers, nor was it meant to. Instead, it opened a door to conversation, self-examination, and reevaluation. Churches, leaders, and individuals were left to wrestle with what they had seen and heard. In that sense, the moment fulfilled a deeper purpose. It was not designed to divide camps, but to invite deeper engagement with what faith leadership truly requires in a rapidly changing world. The conversation did not belong to that stage alone. It belonged to everyone willing to reflect honestly on the responsibilities that come with belief, influence, and trust. The meaning behind the moment. In the end, what happened on February 5th was not about winning or losing. It was about exposure, not of secrets, but of priorities. It reminded those present and those watching from afar that faith is not merely something to be preached, but something to be lived, questioned, defended, and continually refined. Growth, tradition, influence, and humility were all placed under the same light. And in that illumination, the moment proved not destructive but necessary. It challenged comfort, disrupted assumptions, and reaffirmed that meaningful faith is rarely easy, but always worth examining.